remind myself that we're supposed to be recording these. So now we are. So welcome, if this makes it all the way out onto YouTube, which it sometimes does, welcome to this Resurrecting Civility podcast, open topic conversation. And it looks like we're going to spend some time talking about colleges and COVID, and maybe schools and COVID, and who knows what else. So Rachel, you set that up so nicely. I wonder if maybe take another crack at it.
Yeah. So something that's been going through my mind recently, as like I have been a furloughed worker for a while, and as my job is working with school children is gearing back up, and as my little brother Kevin is going away to college for the first time, and those things in my own life happening at the same time, of seeing news articles of places like UNC sending UNC, I think it was Chapel Hill, sending their students back after about a week of in-class instruction, Notre Dame taking a 2-week break. I think a lot about kind of the different patterns that different schools have been taking for how they have spent the last couple months allocating money and resources. So it seems like there's a couple different patterns. Some schools are going for, we want to be in person as much as possible, and we are going to spend money and resources to try and make it safer to be in person. And we are leaning on the idea that with these extra safety measures in place, it will be okay to be in person. Another pattern I've seen is, okay, we can try to be in person, but we also need to make sure that if we do have to go virtual, we have a better infrastructure so that we are more prepared to teach our students virtually. And like the choices that colleges make in the months leading up, of whether they're buying a bunch of tents to use as outdoor classroom space to go on the whole, like, we really want to be in person model, or getting professors more training on using like online resources and investing in kind of more robust models for students to be doing online learning. I'm really interested in how colleges are choosing to spend those resources, how that intersects with the desire to attract a freshman class, who I think a lot of incoming college students would like to be there in person for the whole like college experience thing. So I just am really interested in kind of the decision making behind either really going for we want to make in person as safe as possible, and we're trusting that the things we're doing will work, versus let's just do virtual learning for a semester and make that as great as we can, or shades in between, and why different colleges are choosing to do each of those methods.
Interesting.
Yeah. I guess you have maybe more personal experience right there, Uncle Tom. I don't know how it was like for you guys. The head of for Notre Dame, from my impression, I would think partially the way they would make that decision would be the situation in the surrounding area would probably be a big way to decide whether or not you're going fully virtual or mix or all the way back. And I don't know what exactly what situation you would consider Northern Indiana right now, but I think I read recently that the head of Notre Dame has been pretty adamant going back quite a while that he thought it was worth the risk to go back to class. So I think this might have been.
That seems to be a common theme.
Yeah. So yeah, there's going to be some places probably that people are going to have the heads of school have a perspective, and then some places where the heads of school will make their decision mostly based on the surrounding area, and if it's worse in that area, they might go more remote. I don't know. But.
Yeah.
I think we're not in a bad spot in northern Indiana, but
No, we're not, I don't mean to speak negatively about any particular region, but some places seem to have a hotter time of it right now than we do. In general, South and West. So, yeah. On the other hand, we're in St. Joe County, and as counties go inside Indiana, we are, and with Elkhart next to us, Elkhart's got a more difficult problem, but St. Joe has got a problem as well, but it's a moderate problem by anybody's estimate. I'm trying to remember I should know these numbers actually. One way to measure is what is the infection rate given the sampling you're doing. That's doing the testing you're doing. That's a very imperfect measure because
positive tests per testing or something.
Yeah, that's right. Number of positive cases per test. And people talk about that as if that's one thing. It couldn't be one thing. It depends on where you apply your tests, what your criteria are for testing, et cetera. But if it's, imagine a generic criteria where you got to be concerned either from exposure or from illness of some sort. And then you come in and you get a test. If that's sort of the generic criteria, I think that's not ridiculously far from where a lot of places are. Then what's the percentage of those tests that come back positive? And here I think it is in Indiana, I think we are, boy, I could be wrong. Some of the states have been up over 20 in some regions anyway. And I think we are still pretty high, but under 10%. But I think over 5.
Yeah, I think like 2 is the goal. That's when you get into the.
I think Connecticut's between 1 and 2.
Okay.
But there's been a huge focus on ramping up testing because we were so close to New York that we got hit early, and they were like, we need to fix this immediately.
Yeah. So you probably ought to multiply. It'd be fun to try the numbers here. Somehow you ought to multiply, or you ought to factor in, leave the math aside for a moment, you ought to factor in the percentage of your population that's actually been tested. Right? So if you're testing twice as many of your people, right, then that ought to, what? No, that wouldn't really do it, would it? Because
it depends what the actual amount of positivity out there is. Well,
I'm thinking it does, but I think that's taken into account by the measure of again, we're assuming all tests are the same. Let's not. We know that isn't true, but let for simplicity now, let's assume if you took a test, you get the same probability of getting a positive no matter what test you took or no matter who you are, simplifying a false assumption. If you made that assumption, there's the percent that test positive of test administered, but then there's the relationship between test administered and the whole population. So what if it's a very tiny fraction of the population? What if it's, is it a representative sample in general? It's only when you have a representative sample that you wouldn't have to figure out what's the percentage that you've tested and who precisely have you tested. If it's really representative in some sort of way, right? If you somehow could scramble or the population and just do a random sampling across your entire population, then that would get you something. And then presumably if that were rich enough, you'd pick up those signals from, say, convalescent homes, to be frank. That's where lots of folks are having trouble, or places where there's parties or all kinds of things. You'd see that signal coming through, but you could just go after those with your testing strategy. I wish I could remember the cool name of the approach to surveillance testing that Notre Dame's taken, but it's got about 6 adjectives in it, and they accept 6 adjectives. But it is a reactive surveillance test. It's got a sampling dimension, so it's got a randomization dimension, but it's randomization across populations that are seen in a certain way in light of previous testing. That makes sense. So they're, you know, if all the tests had come positive from one dorm, they might do a sampling across that dorm, because that's been a hot dorm. So anyway,
it seems like a smart way to do it.
Yeah, we're all learning a little bit more about how to think through the mathematics of testing.
This is more broad, but just the statistics in general have been boggling my mind lately. I watched a lot of YouTube videos on how you can, and let me explain myself after I say this first thing, how you can use statistics and manipulate them and talk about them in any particular way to say not just about anything, but you can make something that is not true or representative of what you're talking about seem true by citing numbers. And I just find that so fascinating. So in any article that's citing statistics recently, whether it's about COVID or anything else, I find myself really honing in on the stats and thinking really hard about okay, what is the narrative of what they're saying separated from what is this raw data actually saying itself, and are they making any leaps in the narrative version versus also is the raw data itself representative of what they're trying to say it's representative of.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit of a tangent, but I just
Well, it's no tangent. I mean, it's that's a big issue. Yeah, it sure is. I like the way you connected it to a narrative. We spoke some weeks ago about what are facts? What's the role of perspective in facts? Are facts some neutral thing that, say, is least common denominator accessible across all kinds of different points of view, perspectives, worldviews? Is there some least common denominator that somehow has this fact access, right? Do we have that in light of human evolution, say, right? I mean, you could imagine you being rescued, in effect, by the fact that we've got so much of our DNA in common, say, right? 99 point large percent of our DNA is in common. And maybe that's where our fact gathering capabilities come from. So it is a least common denominator, you might imagine, across all these various perspectives. But I don't think when we look at actual cases, it's as simple as that. Was it a fact that this was self-defense or not? Well, just to take an example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, how much does it matter the vulnerability of the person involved, and what are the vulnerabilities, and what are the goods with respect to which that person is vulnerable, and what are the threats with respect to that other person was infringing, right? And all of those kinds of questions, all of a sudden now they kind of start to sound like points of view matter, right? So if somebody, what would a journalist report be? What would the facts, just the facts? Maybe Kellyanne Conway doesn't sound so bad when she says, well, we've got an alternative set of facts. In the Trump administration, it took a lot of flack for it. But I mean, in any context, how could that not be a reasonable, at least even in the least common denominator case, right? You might say somebody might just have some facts and somebody else has some different facts, right? And they think that these other facts are also relevant, and they say this is an alternative set. And even on the least common denominator, we're all the same with respect to facts model. It would still be a fair thing to say, I think. But boy, did she take flack for it. And maybe she meant it in a flack-worthy way too. I mean, that's another question we could look at it, but it's not obvious that the expression by itself is enough to hang you.
Something that I think about is like, and this verbiage has been getting, like, I see it thrown around a lot on like social media, and in like, there's been like a rise of like on Instagram, people releasing infographics to like teach the masses about some sort of like topic. So for instance, like back in the beginning of June, there were a lot of ones, infographics, like little things that you scroll through on Instagram, like 10 paragraphs or so, brought down into little pictures, about like the protests and various things going on. And something, a term that I've seen brought about a lot is all these things can be true at the same time. And I think that is, that's almost a more palatable way of like saying alternative facts, because like it can be true that I forget exactly what the alternative facts thing was in reference to, but it can, things that seem to paint very different pictures can all be true at the same time. I'm not saying that when people say, oh, these are my facts, that they're necessarily telling the truth. But it definitely is true that things that you can group different facts together to paint very different pictures. And in the same way that you can group facts together to paint different pictures, you can also choose what makes its way into that grouping and choose to leave things out, so that what you're saying is technically true, but in no way representative of the situation. And in my view, like super manipulative. So I think that is like where the idea of narrative's relationship to facts and truth is really interesting, because you can cite certain statistics that like are true, like this is something that was that was scientifically tested and peer reviewed and whatnot. But by choosing to only talk about a certain set of things, if your narrative then jumps to this is what's happening, I think this happens a lot in journalism and even just like people talking to each other. The facts that you have are true, but the narrative, the story you tell yourself and or others around it, makes leaps that the facts did not, that kind of weaponize those facts. And in cases where it's being done poorly, it can like really manipulate people and even yourself.
Nice. That's very nice. So it raises the question, and we can reapply this eventually to COVID and to testing and all kinds of pieces here. But what is what are a range of ways to communicate about facts, which might at least do better in some of these respects than others? Let's see. I mean, something like I'll give you a thumbnail sketch example, and we could start there or start anywhere else you want. What's my story? Me, the fact giver, and who am I talking to and why? You could imagine those things, right? Now that's a lot of information, actually, right? This is my story. This is the way I look at the world, and I want to talk to you. And this is how I understand how you work at you look at the world. And this is what I'm trying to communicate by bringing these pieces of evidence to bear. Now, if my infographic were wrapped in that, I would say somebody would have at least more information than they might otherwise. And maybe that would be a step in a better direction. That's an example of what I mean. I wonder if what is it to communicate fairly, informatively? What is it to pass information, actually? Whatever information is.
Yeah, it is interesting. And it's something that I've always kind of had to think about, because I'm always trying to look for the most objective reporting possible. But as Rachel was just saying, there basically is no such thing as an objective reporter, because just the act of choosing these facts means you chose these facts and left out other facts. So it basically makes it impossible. I mean, you can do your best, which is kind of all you can ask for, but like the closest thing to objective reporting is like Reuters or something, but that's not super helpful all the time. Yeah, so I don't know exactly if you try and communicate information with removing as much of your identifying or removing as much of your own biases as possible, or by explaining them as you share the information. Those would be two ways to combat it, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to dispel something I said earlier real quick. So I am now thinking about what I said before and realizing when I invoked infographics earlier and like the Instagram like sharing of information, I was not like in choosing to do that. I wasn't like trying to suggest that only sharing information about part of a topic of a larger story is misleading in and of itself. I invoked the Instagram infographics that I saw a rise in popularity in early June, only because I see the more prevalent use of the phrase, these things can be true all at the same time. And I think that also that can like, I used that as a response to Kellyanne Conway's alternative facts comment. And I think just to kind of paint a picture about like the idea that things that by grouping facts in certain ways, you can be misleading, but not to suggest that trying to educate people on any particular issue is misleading. That's not what I was trying to say at all. And I'm an avid consumer of a lot of those, so they have been very helpful to me. But something that while you were talking, I was thinking about, John, is I would definitely agree that there is like no true distilled unbiased reporting, because like, I mean, anytime you add narrative into a report, I feel like truth is not, this is something I was kicking around earlier. I feel like truth is not a quality that applies to narrative as a whole. Truth is a quality that can apply to certain pieces. Like if I tell you, I guess it depends how big the narrative is. But like, for an example, and this is going to be a poor example because I'm thinking out loud. If I say the purple dog jumped over the green cat and the world smiled or something like that, I can make truth claims like, oh, like I witnessed with my own eyes, like I saw the purple dog jump over the green cat. And like you can distill information down into little pieces and like soundbite approve, like, yes, this is something that truth can definitely apply to. But I do think there's some things that you can express with words that truth doesn't seem to apply to. Like, you could definitely say something that's false, but I feel like there are some things that you could say that could be provably false, but not provably true. So
or true, do you see those as the same? I mean, you might say truth doesn't apply because I can't settle the issue, or you might say truth doesn't apply because there's no issue to be settled.
that's what I mean. I don't mean truth doesn't apply because I can't resolve it. I'm not talking about like I can't like the topic of religion. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about truth doesn't apply because there is no issue to be settled. Yes.
No settleable issue in the neighborhood. There's issues, if I'm following you. Am I? There's issues here, there's disagreements here, but there's just no fact of the matter about who's right and who's not.
Yes.
Okay.
Your example earlier about this was self-defense. I think that's a really great example because that is a narrative way of describing like, okay, so what happened was this person broke into their house or broke into my house and then they had a gun, so I shot them. Like those are the provable facts. Like, let's say I have a video. So like there is truth. Truth is a principle that would apply to that. But the concept, the more, I guess, abstract concepts or something that truth might not apply to as much. The assertion that this was self-defense, to me, it doesn't feel like truth is a useful or even appropriate quality to apply to that statement. I feel like I could say, I felt as though I was acting in self-defense. Truth could apply to that. But like to just say this act was self-defense, I don't think truth can apply to that.
From the person's perspective or just in general? I mean,
in general.
Because that's what our justice system would do its best at determining would be if that was true.
And conviction is beyond reasonable doubt. What is doubt if it's not thinking false? And what if beyond reasonable doubt is more than the preponderance of evidence makes it the case that you really have to assent to this claim. And if you don't, you're outside of reason once you're informed the way the jury's been informed, say, or the judge. You put yourself outside. Isn't that sort of the way we talk about it? And aren't those things like self-defense? And
I'm trying to think of an example that is not within the justice system. You could say, like, saying somebody was rude. Like, if somebody does something that I don't like and I say that was rude, I feel like truth, there's more layers to that, and it feels harder to like 100% say that truth definitely apply, that this thing can be 100% like, let me set proven aside for a second, but like that this can be 100% true or 100% false.
In that case, I think that's true because rudeness in some cases is only determined in the eye of the beholder, basically. So, I mean, only that person could ever know. But
yeah, and I don't raise this issue as like to make some great point in and of itself, but what I do raise it for was in response to your thought earlier that there like can be no like objective reporting that is like not like I think Reuters is an example of like the closest thing we get. I definitely like think some people do a better job than others. Like some people are clearly not trying and are like their job is to help push an agenda. And if you're like not claiming to be fair and balanced, and you are like clear, like if you're not claiming to be presenting the entire scenario and you still are not, like there's something to be said for like different types of print media. But I do think it is a problem in weighing journalism, that parts of narrative, like parts of a narrative, I feel like there are things you can't make truth claims about. And the other thing that popped into my head is going back to the Instagram infographic thing. So like, I think individual instances of sharing information about like a specific topic is like great, and like that's how we learn better things. Like every book, like books don't need to be about everything, and they wouldn't be very good books if they were about everything. Who wants to read an encyclopedia and just an encyclopedia? But I think when that becomes a problem is because no scholarship exists in a vacuum, and when we start selecting scholarship, or even just like any type of media that only looks at either one side of a topic or one section of a historical event, I think that's when we fail to be able to engage with people who have not encountered that same set of facts, who I guess who have encountered alternative facts. And I don't, I'm trying to use the unloaded version of that word. They have encountered alternative facts about a particular scenario, and either not encountered yours or not seriously encountered yours. And the more we like echo chamber ourselves, the less able and willing we are to engage with others about, I guess, anything.
Boy, there's a lot in there, but there's also there's some coherence to the pieces that you've assembled in that way of describing our reality, right? That we are somehow narrative bound critters, and we can sort of escape we sounds like we can escape we can escape some of the dimensions of our differences in virtue of some things. You had mentioned the purple dog jumping over that.
Such a silly example.
And then I get it. In other words, just you can imagine things that, in fact, it's difficult to disagree with that it happened. I mean, who are you going to believe, right? Me or your own lying eyes? People joke about it, right? That's sort of the origin of that joke. Your own lying eyes are actually not, typically they don't lie. Sometimes they do, but there's some really clear cases, right? And you were pointing to some, but you were limiting that domain, right? And saying in all kinds of more interesting areas, it doesn't seem like we can break outside of our own perspectives. And there's a lot in there.
Like this is art is another one. Like I feel like there's so much that you can say and express with words that truth doesn't neatly apply to.
Religion, art, and morality. How about those three? The triangle.
Yeah.
Okay. And maybe there's some other things, but that's a pretty nice.
I would even separate religion from the other two, because like I feel like there can be a truth about religion. We just might not be able to prove it, but like I feel like the existence of a God could be either true or not true. And I think truth applies to it, even if we can't access that truth in a way that, like, this is art, I don't think has the same true or not true claim to it, even if we still can't access it.
Is it because in the one case you have some idea of what it would mean for you to be correct, you think, right?
Yes.
In the other case, you have
Well,
no idea what it would mean for you to be correct. I have no idea what it would be for me to be, all of a sudden now I get art, right? Oh, I see it now, right? And I know what all the art is and all the other people.
I just think there is no, like, it's not that I don't get it. And if I were to get more information, I finally would get it. I don't think there is.
But you do
I don't.
with religion. You do with religion and you don't with art, and maybe you don't with morality either. Insofar as you pulled religion out of that pile of that.
Yeah, I think like the existence of a God could either be true or not true. And like whether we like, it makes me think of like, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it still make a sound? Yes. Like, I think so. I'm not like arguing. I don't separate religion out like specifically to make an argument that like, yes, there definitely is a God. But I separate it out because I think you can, like, truth as a concept can apply to, I guess, rather than religion as a whole, like the existence of a creator, I think truth could apply to, but like the worthiness of certain aspects of a religion, I think then would come back into my into the other category of like truth does not apply to this. So like within religion, the question like is there like a godly being, I put in a separate category as truth does apply to this, but other aspects of religious debates would almost definitely belong in the other category as well.
Morality as a whole you might remove that as well then, because if there could be a God, we just don't know. There also could be a true version of morality. We just don't know.
And art.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
So suppose you could specify conditions such that with regard to religion, say, and there being a God or not, let's see, you could imagine some set of conditions in the future in which you could communicate with any other person you wanted to, and you all shared the same opinion, right? Which is that, oh yeah, there's a God, and it really mattered. What happens now makes entire sense in terms of how we dealt with that question, right? You could imagine some future state of agreement among people. But you could imagine that. It might be a little harder to imagine, but you could imagine all of a sudden everybody's got a clear moral sense after they die, and everyone's got a clear artistic sense too, and they all just agree. They can all see it now. Then everybody agrees. And if that was the case, would you agree that universal assent was some sign, as much in the one case as in the other? If it were present, maybe harder to imagine it's present in some cases than others.
I guess, yeah, like that does, if you consider the possibility for potential truth just unobservable, that's not English. Which it seems like it was, if I'm treating the potential truth, albeit unobservable, as sufficient to say truth can apply to this concept, then I guess everything could apply, because like you could, like that's a super slippery slope. Interesting though. I want to sit down and write some stuff because
Yeah.
I don't know what I like. This is a fully half-baked idea, but I do think, I think the trust in journalism, like if some of these details could get hammered out, it could be super helpful. Like truth claims in narrative form, like if there could be some like substantive claims about that, I think that could be useful in
Mm-hmm.
explaining the phenomenon of like people reporting about the same event very differently, and this technically still being true but like not representative. I think it would be helpful in journalism.
Do you think it's question to either? Do you think it's possible that a person might we use the phrase disclosure? Could a person, is there an actual spectrum of forthrightness in disclosure so that a person might say, hey, look, this is what I think, and this is what I want, and this is what I want from you. And that's why I'm sharing these things with you now, right? Where somebody leans pretty hard into each of those areas. Is it possible to be, and here I want to abstract from can you really know your own mind and questions like that. I'm not trying to get at can you, is there a maximum speed? We can go faster and slower, and we can leave aside the question of whether C is fixed in the universe, right, or something like that. There's faster and slower. Can we be more and less in terms of forthright, in terms of providing information about why we're communicating and what we think, right, and what these phrases that we're using to communicate actually mean to us and why we're using them? And would simply descriptive forthright descriptive commentary on the information that's being sent, would that move us in the direction of being more objective in some important sense? The sense that I'm not lying to you, I'm not outside my perspective, I sure have one. I'm not outside my intentions, I definitely have them. I'm just telling you what they are as well as I can. Does that sound like, is that, if I could do that, is that a kind of objectivity? Again, without, imagine there's a complete measure of objectivity or that we know what that is. Am I going faster now? Am I being more forthright, more objective in a certain sense? What I say is true. A larger measure of what I say is true. When I say this is what I think, that's true. When I say this is what I value, that's true. When I say this is what I'm trying to accomplish in this communication, that's true, or at least it could be. These are things that could be true. Are they? It's one thing to say whether my value claim is right or wrong. It's another thing to say whether I hold this value, or at least whether I believe I hold this value. And can't you begin to get some purchase there where a person could say, yeah, I really do believe these things, and I can provide evidence, and I could persuade you actually, right? That this is who I am, where I'm coming from, what I'm trying to accomplish, and why I'm providing you with this information now.
I definitely think that would be a step forward, but I think that is basically already happens to some extent. It's just that would be like saying the quiet part out loud. Like if you watch Fox, like you know that they have this type of worldview and this type of understanding. They don't say it out loud, but you do kind of know that if you're watching Fox, if you're watching CNN, you think in general, they probably have this type of worldview. I mean, it might be better if they actually articulated what that worldview and their belief system was. But I think we all know to some extent, at least in the more extreme examples, that there already is this subtext that exists.
Well, that there's subtext we might know. I think that's true.
So, I mean, they could write that down, but
Do we believe all the facts that are presented as we look across the various sources of information that there are in the media or elsewhere? Do we more or less believe what they say? We just interpret what they say in terms of what we know about what they're up to.
Yeah, I would say even the news media outlets that I am least inclined to watch, because I think the way they draw information together is not effective or truthful. I think in general, they are reporting on certain truths, but they are using a manipulative narrative or manipulative particular set of truths to paint a particular story.
or that they could actually believe that's how the story goes.
Oh, totally. When I say manipulative, I don't think sometimes I think individual anchors are intentionally being manipulative, but when I say manipulative, I mean, in my view, manipulative. I look at the relationship between what I would consider facts and the larger narrative they're painting. And to me, it looks manipulative because of the leaps that the narrative takes that the facts don't definitely support.
I guess that could be a case where I don't know what it would even look like, but a forward or something talking about how the journalist thinks about the situation from the get-go, and or larger situation surrounding it, but I don't know what exactly.
I actually like.
Look on the top. But go ahead, Ray.
I actually like the idea of, and I have no answers on what this would look like, but I like the idea of more context surrounding the narrative they're talking about rather than or maybe even in addition to the speaker's personal views, because I definitely think that giving more information about the speaker or organization's views and objectives is good because it's more context. It paints more of a picture and it really draws attention to this is not merely factual material. There are other forces at play here other than merely your education. So we're providing additional context, which I think is important. But I think about, okay, who is the center of that context? If the speaker is providing additional context about their own or the organization they work for's goals, the additional context is focused with the speaker at the center. And something that either in addition or instead of, I think, is more effective would be to, at the center of the extra context, put the subject of which they are reporting. So whether it be a protest or anything that a news anchor is talking about, I am more interested in more information about the thing that they're talking about from another perspective than I am about just hearing the speaker's personal views. I think like immediately a problem that like runs to my head is what's to stop the additional context provided about the situation from being also poisoned by like other agendas. And like that's a problem that would definitely need to be addressed. But I
perspective poisoned by an agenda. What is it to poison communication?
I think of
an agenda as opposed to simply have an agenda.
I think the degree to which your agenda comes into play, like I think of advertising, like there's all sorts of laws about advertising about like when, like for instance, you can't advertise on kids programming, or like on kids programming, the character in the show can't appear in the ad, and there has to be like, you know how there's like and like Sesame Street will be back after these messages. So like that's put in place as like, okay, this is, you definitely know the line between advertising and like they're trying to sell you something and the kids programming. Like they can't put Big Bird in an ad for like baby wipes or whatever. But I think like when your agenda is the main focus and why you're presenting information in a particular fashion, I think when that's done to a certain degree, I think I would use the word poisoning. But like painting could also be used. Like if I am trying to convince you to go out and vote, I can give data that I would say like paints a picture in a particular way that encourages you to vote. You could also provide a bunch of equally true or like equally true facts about like how like I don't like if you are a red voter in a super blue district, I could give you true information that leads you to draw the conclusion that it's not worth you coming out to vote. So I think that's a good example of how like you could say totally true things that come to different, like that lead the listener to come to totally different conclusions. And I think when that crosses the threshold into poison for me is when it's being done manipulatively or like in a way that leads you to believe something that is less likely to be true. And like this is rife for bias, like, but I just want to explain my language use a little bit. The reason I use poison when I think by choosing the information they share in a particular fashion, they are more focused on pushing a particular agenda than educating the listener. Like in my Huggies diapers ads, I am clearly more focused on getting the consumer to buy Huggies than I am about teaching them about the importance of diapers.
Mm-hmm.
Poor example, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, something. Right. Okay. Interesting. So there's a lot of pieces on the table now that I think are somehow we have to line them up. Here, I actually, maybe you can see right in front of me. I may be stuck on this line them up metaphor because I'm sitting in front of me. Carefully so that we can.
A lot of pieces on the table.
Exactly. But nonetheless, it's not a bad metaphor, so I'll use it anyway. I heard words like education. I heard words like manipulate. So we actually probably ought to think for a little bit about what those words are. What do we mean by education? And then when do we think it ought to be present? Maybe it ought to be present, for example, when it seems to be present. Maybe it ought not to be seem to be present, but in fact not be present. You could imagine some definition of education. For example, informing you about something that's true and that will be useful to you. Maybe that has an educative dimension. But if in fact what you're doing is conveying something that's false, when you seem like you're conveying something that's true, that would be to seem to educate, but in fact not. So education, what's manipulation? Is persuasion manipulation? When I try to persuade you and I succeed, am I manipulated you? I think we don't. The answer is obviously not, just from the way we use the words, but why? What is it? What is it to manipulate? Is it to persuade you but not seem to persuade you? Is it to produce a different outcome than I reveal myself to be intending to produce? Maybe that's what it is. I wonder whether that would do it.
I think the first thing that I'm tempted to say is when someone is persuading in the best sense, they are willing to take an opposing point seriously. When someone's trying to manipulate, I think they would be less inclined to take an opposing point of view seriously.
Would that be true for educating too, I wonder? Whether taking another person seriously is a requirement of educating them, as opposed to just sticking a belief in their head that makes them do what they want, do what you want them to do. As if it didn't matter what they know about the world. I'm not taking them seriously as someone whose opinion counts. I already know what they ought to do, and here it is, right? When I want your opinion, I'll beat it out of you, the joke goes, right? In this case, when I want your opinion, I'll give it to you. So I'm not taking you seriously as someone I actually have to inform for a reason, educate so you can contribute. So I'm seeing maybe a common factor between things that seem pretty different, the educative function and the persuasive versus manipulative, or educative versus whatever the opposite of that is. We could certainly say miseducation and just stick a word in there, but we could do better than that probably. To educate versus to lie to or to hoodwink. Hoodwink also suggests more on the side of getting, you can impact somebody's belief and you can impact their desires, right? And if you're manipulating them, it probably makes reference to their desires in some way. And if you're educating them, it probably makes reference to their belief system in some way.
That seems like a good distinction to me.
So, is taking their participation seriously, taking on one hand what they believe about the world as a serious component, right, out of which they participate, out of which they form, they put together a set of beliefs and envision a certain set of outcomes and desire those outcomes and try to pursue those outcomes. You have to have an account of the world first somehow. You have to know what's true. And you could also try you could get at what it is they're trying to do by going into the information that they have, or you might do a short circuit. And here I'm remembering the difference between cognitive and non-cognitive information passing mechanisms, right? I might actually tell a person, or I might just sort of frown while I say something, or shake my head at just the right moment, right? Or, you know what I mean? Just sort of cast unapproving looks in the colors that I choose, in the all kinds of different subtle ways, right? In the speed at which I rest on certain points. Things that you could make a study of that. How do you get people to do what you want them to do, right? And you could throw all that stuff at them and tell them nothing. And basically, you're really treating them as an object where you're trying to produce an outcome, not by bypassing their informed. You're trying to bypass their information involvement and do things which they don't know you're doing to them to get them to behave in ways that you want them to behave rather than in ways that they choose to behave. All of that is not taking them seriously as a person, as a participant, as someone you need, someone whose opinions matter, someone whose opinions need to be informed and have the capacity for contributing. Maybe that measure could, I guess I'm putting it forward to see what you think. Maybe all communication ought to take the person seriously as someone who can be informed, should be informed, and who can formulate preferences and make decisions based upon information. That's what it is to treat a person seriously. That's what it is to actually inform them. And it's when you shortcut that whole process in various ways that you are slanting the news, poisoning it, manipulating it.
I think my initial thought is that I like that distinction. I think there's a few areas in which it could get a little fuzzy. Like, I think about like a college professor lecturing to a bunch of students. Like on a one-to-one basis, I think that distinction is productive, but I'm thinking about like, what are the logistics of treating a focus on the existing belief system of individual students, knowing that they will be very different. If you have, like, let's say 100 students in your class, and the word that like jumps into my head, like if you're doing that, like, and I think this runs the risk of throwing too many terms around. But like, my question is like, where does training fit into the like piece of the puzzle? Like, if you're unable to, like in a small liberal arts classroom, like I totally can picture like a very discussion-based course that the professor has the certain things that they want to, like they have the goalposts that they want the students in the class to leave knowing or working towards. And they can adjust the approach to take into account what and where the students are now. Whereas like if you are teaching like a chemistry 101 class to 300 students at UConn, like, or any other large public university, you don't have that same luxury. And I don't think like that doesn't seem dishonest, and like that feels like I want that to be fine. So I'm trying to like rectify in my head how that can still be fine in this model, or if that means the model doesn't fully explain what's going on.
Okay. I see why you would want some things to be fine in there, but we could go back and say what those things are precisely that you would want to be fine in those contexts. We could also look at those same contexts and wonder whether you can be not fine in both of those circumstances. what are the ways in which you can, I mean, I think that would be a very useful exercise, would be to take a range of, and you just laid out a couple. And how can you go wrong? And what is it that's not going wrong, that but that may also not be, you can't have a seminar discussion about the history of chemistry and whether chemistry took a good turn back in 1794, right? You can't do that and still learn any chemistry, right? Right. So and if somebody wants to talk about that, you kind of push them aside a little bit nicely, right? But you're not going to invite that question in. Whereas in a different kind of a small seminar, you might very well invite a question in. Am I?
Yeah, definitely. I
putting my
think
in a different context of the way that you meant to be doing.
No, that's what I meant.
Yep. So let me go ahead and try this assertion out and see what you think, because it seems to me it might be right, that I'd be willing to stand behind it so far as I can see it at this moment. Rachel, looks like the sun is set, and hopefully you're.
Yeah, I'm walking out right now. I'm close to my car.
Doesn't communication in all those venues need to take each person seriously as a person, as someone who has a right, a need, and thus a right, to use that language that we've used before, a need of a certain kind, and thus a right to pursue information and to encounter people who mean to inform them in the communications they have with them, mean not to short circuit the taking on of information and the processing of information and the contributing to social answers, to actually making a contribution. In other words, you got to inform them and listen to them. That's what it is to take a person seriously. And doesn't all communication, both in the chemistry class and in the, I don't know what it is, a humanities, some humanities class, which has a great deal more latitude for exploring different points of view, right? In both of those, you have to treat that person similarly as a contributor.
Yeah, I just think treating that person as a person and as a contributor would necessarily have to look different for each scenario, which isn't.
Yeah. You with us still, Rachel? Pause here for a moment.
Yeah, so interesting. So she had mentioned, or we've been going over the potential problems in the big classroom, and then the right and wrong way in a small classroom in the humane letters standpoint. I was imagining some of my college classes experiences where we were reading, I don't know, something like Frankenstein or something like that, and people would be bringing up these perspectives, but you could tell that the teacher was just waiting to hear the right answer before we moved on. So they weren't actually like taking into account that there could be other ways to view this piece of the text. There's just, they wanted to just hear the right thing and then we could move on. But But what I'm interested in is also how we get from this discussion of how important it is to take into account other people's perspectives, and to treat other people as people, basically, is how we get back to journalism from here. I'm not even really sure where we're coming from.
Fair enough. I'd like to do that too. Let's check with Rachel. Rachel,
Yeah.
you with us?
Yeah, plenty happy to do that.
Okay. Good. Well, journalism and then communication about facts and relevant facts and crises. Yeah, what does all that look like? And infographics and so presumably journalism is a kind of always involves conveying of information. Does that seem right? There's many facets of it.
Certainly, yeah.
Even when you're editing and you're taking things out, you're still shaping the communication of information. Don't right? Even that's got a communication function. And sometimes this is too much information. TMI, right? You're gonna blow. Say what? Right? It's not that what you're saying isn't true, but don't tell them all that. They'll stop listening. Just to take one example, and others, we can't afford to put it in the paper. We'll go out of business, and then no one will get informed. There's another one, and we could go on and on. They all seem to be concerned with information and communicating information, which means, and let's just drop in that postulate that there's a right to that people have a right to expect people in journalism to conduct all of their affairs with respect to I'll use the phrase and correct it later, the proper functioning of their audience. By proper functioning, I mean you're treating them like a human being who takes things in, thinks things through, makes informed decisions, and makes contributions, has something worthwhile to offer, right? That whole package, which could be described better than that, but that's a short version of it. I think if you're, insofar as you're not engaged in every facet of the journalistic process with respect for that functionality in your audience, seems to me people really do have a need where it actually is in the interests of every person to recognize that need and work toward its satisfaction in general, and a particular professional obligation to do that. So people have a right, a stronger right, to expect it from journalists in the same way they have a stronger right to expect safeguarding safety from engineers. Right? In general, people ought to care about your safety, but gosh, the people who see inside the black box and are the only ones who know what's in there and know how you could be injured by it, right? You're really screwed if those people don't pay attention to it. So you have a just demand on their attention to safety. That's the foundation of professional obligation towards safety in engineering. And it seems to me that there's something like that in journalism also. A professional.
It definitely makes a lot of sense to me. I'm just not actually sure what that actually looks like. Does it look like trying to share both sides of opinions on a particular subject, or trying to What was that?
Where's the idea of both come from? It's amazing how often we use that. Why should
Well,
we?
it certainly applies to most topics that in American culture, at the very least. But
It could be because we're all unbelievably stupefied, infantilized by the idea of both sides of a question. Or maybe there's something more to it.
well, so
Infantilization.
we could skip past that and just say all the sides of a.
We could, sure.
And I think in general that is more true of how it's an easy summary to say both sides of an issue, but in general there will always be, even in American politics, there are always many sides to an issue and many different perspectives. But
Okay.
So how, as a journalist, what would your professional obligation be to entertain and to treat all of the readers' perspectives as worthwhile? How would you do that?
Sure.
Yes, yeah.
How about interviewing a variety of sources who have access to the kinds of information that various of your readers are reasonably believed? Complex.
Should a journalist account for who their readers are likely to be?
I see no alternative, no professional alternative. Should an engineer be accountable for who the users of a product are likely to be? And thinking through safety seems to me absolutely.
Well, a writer over at Breitbart would only interview the most right-wing perspectives if he expected most of his readers to be right-wing.
Yeah. Now, there's something to be said for that perspective. I think not everybody needs to talk to everybody. You could imagine a community who says, look, we would like you to report the news that is particularly of interest to us. And here are our central concerns. And these are the sorts of topics that we really want to find somebody to think are important and go find information that's relevant to these concerns.
It does seem like we're getting away very quickly from the professional obligation to entertain the perspectives of all their possible readers, though.
I don't think so.
I think that's exactly that's how you end up with the media that we have now, is when you cater to the readers that you expect to have.
Yeah, but we need more distinctions than we have here. I think it is quite possible to cater to. It's easy for the German American newspaper. Let's go back 150 years or something, right? The Der Nordsterner, I happen to know, big Midwestern, I think Minnesota-based, or maybe it was Wisconsin, but in that region, based newspaper, and they published a lot of things that were of concern to the German community. And for one, you had to read German. So the Polynesian community in San Francisco just wasn't reading Der Nordsterner, right? And it wasn't an issue. But insofar as there were different subsets, insofar as there were, say, Prussian readers versus German readers versus Austrian readers, and they're covering the World War, the First World War, or any really, I would expect first there are practical considerations. You'll lose readership if you don't pay any attention to some of these people, right?
Yeah.
You'll lose them. But you ought to lose them put it this way, insofar as you're the only source of news they have, don't you have a professional obligation to take into account their perspectives? I think you do. It's not everyone's perspective. It's those perspectives that you have a reasonable and a forthright intention of communicating to. So someone putting together a journal for people of this mind might very well put a journal together from that point of view. And they say just who they are and who they're writing for. And they don't have an obligation to publish other points of view, not in that journal, but they might have an obligation not to misrepresent those other points of view. They could underrepresent them. They might have an obligation not to misrepresent them grossly in a way which bypasses the rational. I mean, they shouldn't brainwash their readers.
Right.
All those other people are idiots. We all like this point of view, or we all think it. Maybe so, but that treats those other individuals as something less than human contributors. Even though they're not the people who you are primarily informing, they are people you're talking about. And that would be an example of how in a more narrowly focused publication, that kind of journalistic integrity could come through.
So it is fine to cater to a certain subset of readers as long as you do not misrepresent, or you can talk about stories that are relevant to those readers, but it's not fair to misrepresent the stories of or the opinions of people who have different perspectives.
It's not fair to, it might be fair to differently represent them, and the other people would say you're misrepresenting them. But you don't intend to misrepresent them, right? You're not intending to. You're intending to say what you think is actually true about their point of view. And you're trying to say, in fact, they are preoccupied with this particular value, right? And someone from that point of view might say, that's false about us. We're not over preoccupied. We disagree with you and you're misrepresenting us. And the answer might be, no, we're not really misrepresenting you. We are differently representing you. We're representing you from our perspective. And we don't mean to say that you agree with us. And we decidedly don't mean to say that you're idiots and that your perspective ought not to be taken into account. It ought to be taken into account. And when it's articulated, it ought to be articulated in a way which enables somebody to enter into it and understand what it's like to hold that perspective. And here we're heading into some more substantial ground of the sort that we've covered a lot.
Yeah. I mean, and that certainly seems, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of news sites on radically different sides of the aisle or perspective actually believe that they might believe that about themselves, but that's not actually how it plays out. They think that they want to accurately represent the other side, but what they're actually doing is misrepresenting them. So it sounds awesome, but it doesn't. All you can go on is people's perspectives from that point of view.
So they might just suck at it, right? I mean, you could imagine engineers, for example, who are really bad at safety. It's not impossible. In which case, the state of affairs there is that they are, as a class, failing to meet up to their professional obligations.
Mm-hmm.
That's possible. And you can say that about journalism too, and you might say that about journalism today. And then you can ask, what are the remedies for that? Yeah, are there possible remedies? If there are no possible remedies, that would be that'd be one thing, right? Quit your complaining, right? There's nothing you can do about it. Would be a fair retort. But if there are possible remedies, then you'll want to say what they are, and you'll want to make it part of civic education, definitely part of education in journalism. And I think it used to be. And I don't know very much. I mean, I had one journalism class in my life when I was a senior in high school. And I became our town newspaper's reporter for girls' high school athletics. It's true. And I even had a press box. And that's as close.
Wow. Yeah.
Much more interested in getting close to the high school athletes than I was the high school story. But
Yeah.
I mean, that's true. But I also, I learned a little bit. I had a 3-credit course, and I remember thinking hard about slanting the news, what slanting the news was. What was it to deliberately omit facts, which what? Now I don't actually remember what we said about slanting the news, but I'm projecting back into it. I think I know what they should have said and probably did say. And that is things that a reasonable person, were he or she to know that for those facts were included, would judge them to have been rightly included and useful, right, in exercising their own autonomy as an informed citizen. And I think we slant the news all the time now.
Yeah. And I think the last interesting, or the last thing I have to say on it is, even if we were to give everyone the benefit of the doubt and say news could operate on some level in the appropriate way, where people were just catering to their own audience and hopefully not misrepresenting the other side's view, that would work, except for the case that many of the larger news outlets like to represent themselves as bipartisan or trying to look at things from all sides. And
right.
So
fair and balanced. Or yeah.
So I mean, and then they would have even more of an obligation to try and represent both sides faithfully. And I think one of my favorite things to listen to right now is the Daily Podcast, which is the New York Times podcast. And I think it's because they, at least, I don't think they do it particularly well, but at least they make the effort to make it look like they're representing both sides, which is kind of sad that that's the most I can hope for these days. But I think that is. I think it's cute that they still try to do it because no one else is even attempting. But yeah, so I think that adds another little wrinkle where most of the larger newspapers would say that they are not catering it to an audience. They're just trying to report the truth as they find it.
Right. I'm inclined to think that they are naive, or if not actually naive, they may not be naive because they may actually know that there's a very large gap between the standards that they say they're trying to adhere to and what they actually do. So they may not be naive. They may not actually think they hit that standard. They may know better than any of us how they fall short of that standard, and thus they're not naive at all. That's a possibility. But insofar as they market papers as if they're succeeding in hitting that standard, if they know they fall very far short of that standard, it seems to me they're to be blamed. That's people need to understand if we fall short. In the same way we would if all our engineers sucked and the world were a whole lot more dangerous than we thought, right? It would be very good for us to know that. We ought to know something about the state of engineering.
Yeah. Well, the big problem with the difference between those two scenarios is that there aren't a ton of people who love to hear about building collapses or love to be in collapsed buildings, but maybe not the best comparison. But there are a lot of people who like to hear a very particular worldview, regardless of respecting people who think differently or not.
Well, I think we got closer to what would COVID communication and infographics, what should you reasonably expect? We might use the rights language. What do you have a right to expect? Whether you're wise to anticipate it is a different thing, right? Expect in that sense, right? But you're in your rights to demand it. That people are not bypassing you as someone who's incapable of being actually informed, right? And just communicating precisely to get a response from you of the sort that they've calculated is the right response.
Yes.
And they pretend to be informing you, but they have no such intention at all. They're not trying to inform you. They're trying to, exactly here the right word, manipulate you. They're trying to produce an outcome in you by bypassing your cognitive capabilities. They don't care about those. They're just trying to find a key to turn the right crank and get you to behave the way that they want. And they make it seem as if they smuggle that key in as information. But that's not what they're up to. If put it this way, maybe that's an easy target to try. That it seems to me is exactly what we would label that as propaganda. We would label that as manipulation. We would label that as fake news, because it's not news. It's a different thing going on. It's not journalism. It's not trying to inform you. And that can't be the same as everybody who thinks something different than I do, right? It can't be that. That can't be what fake news is, but there is such a thing as fake news. And it seems to me we're in a position to draw that distinction and insist on some rights in that space.
Yeah, it may be a little bit of a one-sided, politically loaded term, but one way I've heard it described is many people who describe themselves as journalists are actually activists, and they're not actually trying to report on anything or give you a version of the truth. They're trying to forward their view of the world, basically.
Yeah. Again, we need to make a distinction about how you're forwarding your view.
Yeah, it's not very. Yeah.
That there's nothing non-journalistically appropriate about that.
I would not want
Standardly set up.
a journalist. If I was trying to ascertain the truth about something, I would not want an activist.
What do you mean by an activist? Somebody who's trying to persuade you in any way?
I would not want someone trying to persuade me towards their perspective.
Gosh, I would. I'd be happy. I'd say bring it on. Right?
Well, I guess it depends. It depends on. Yeah, it very depends on the situation. I mean, my favorite thing is I want someone to try to persuade me one way, and then I want to intelligence squared. That's my favorite thing. Have you ever watched those?
Not much.
It's a 2-hour long debate. They're on YouTube. If you just look up intelligence squared, and they have a bunch of different topics. There's a whole proper debate setting. So I do like. It's basically two people for the motion, like America needs Medicare for all or something, and then two people against the motion. And then they go do their openings, and then they do an argument, and then the other people refute the argument, and it's a lot of fun. So I do like that. For news, though, I guess I would have to come up with a specific example that I'm not. I guess if I was trying to understand what was going on in Portland exactly, I wouldn't want an activist trying to give me the news. I would want as close to an approximation of what was really happening if I was actually going to form an opinion.
Yeah, that's interesting that you're imagining that there is something that is actually happening and not just these multiple perspectives on what's going on there, as if that's all there is, are multiple perspectives of what's going on. And maybe the best you can ever get is someone who's concerned about you as a person who ought to participate and is bringing you their perspective on what's actually happening, their perspective on what's actually happening. There is no perspective free what's actually happening. There's only all these people interacting with their various perspectives. And some of them are willing to share those perspectives with you with an eye toward bringing you aboard their perspective and their account of what ought to happen. And I would be delighted if that's all I ever got. That's actually all I ever expect.
Well, it seems very difficult to differentiate that from someone trying to manipulate you.
I don't see the difficulty. I don't see the difficulty because I don't intend to bypass the cognitive faculties of people that I'm speaking with. Shame on me if I ever do. And it's not that shames never do, because we all have tendencies in argumentation. We look bad for a moment, for example, and we strike back in an argument. How has that ever happened? It has for me, right? Mm-hmm. I think it probably does for you temperamentally, knowing you a whole lot less than it has for me over my life. But I have learned to recognize those things, and I'm not proud of them. In fact, I try to resist them. And I try to really care about what the person thinks that I'm interacting with. And in many points, I'm trying to persuade them because I've thought through these things too. And the very problems that they're trying to wrestle with from their perspective admit of solutions when that perspective is transformed. That's my take on it. So I tell them that straight out. I do think that's possible. And I think that if I gave an account of what's happening, if I accumulated facts, if I accumulated a report that had lots of quantification, lots of data, lots of tables, right? All of that. If I brought my scientific thought process and keenest powers of observation, I would still think that they are my powers of observation, that they're the things that I see. Someone else might see different things than I see. But I put all that together and offer it. I may not know what ought to happen, by the way. Tons of times I don't. And so I ought not to pretend that I do when I don't.
Yeah, yeah, and I think I would be very willing, if you had done that, or if you were on the ground there, I would be willing to take that perspective seriously. But maybe I missed it, but I'm not sure that how the comparison to how you would do it to how I think other people who are mostly in the news right now, I don't think that's how they would operate. I think there is a difference. I don't think they would be willing to admit that this is just my perspective and I could totally be wrong, but
No, I think you're right about that, but I think we're in a very poor state of journalism. So I think you could find all kinds of substandard reporting. I guess what I mean to say is I'm just not. I don't think you have to have non-biased reporting is not the same. I would put it this way, as not being objective in reporting. What I mean by that is, what I mean by objectivity is straightforward.
they are trying to tell the truth.
The way I described earlier, and that doesn't mean that I don't have a perspective. I do. That doesn't mean that nobody else's perspective, which might be very different than mine, is possibly right. I do think you gotta take into account all of them, but there is no escaping from any of them. There is some state of affairs where you don't have an opinion yet, but that's not a better state of affairs. That's a worse state of affairs. There may be some, I don't mean to deny that there could be some instrumental value. You could send a deliberately young person in. You don't want them to draw any conclusions. It's over their freaking head, right? You just want them to take pictures, so to speak, right? But even then, what are you taking pictures of? What is it you see? Right? And how do you stage it? And what do you put in the photograph? All of that is perspective. All of that is point of view. You could send someone in naively and gather, I agree you could get something out of that, but I don't think you'd be being informed. I think you'd be underinformed by that person. And when, insofar as you are informed, you're informed by somebody who understands, and that always is somebody who has a perspective. And they ought to care when they communicate that perspective about you as a different, potentially different thinking human being who could contribute their own useful perspective. So that's where I think the profession needs to go. And people need to be able to talk like that. It's not bias free, but there is a kind of objectivity. There's a frankness.
Yeah, I guess, it'd be interesting to try and compare what examples of journalism like that look like and what journalism that is intended maybe not even to manipulate. Well, I guess that would be the difference, right? It'd be that those are the two alternatives. One is journalism that is trying to consider me as a human being with a different opinion, and the other main type of journalism would be journalism intended to manipulate.
I think there's a third type. There's a kind that does not intend to manipulate, but is blind to the fact that their perspective is a particular perspective. If you were blind to that fact, you think the way it seems to you is the way it was. And you put it forward as the way it is with no intention to manipulate, you're just clueless. You just don't know that somebody else standing there would have taken a different photograph. They would have interviewed different people. They would have seen a different story developing. All of that. Now, you might know there are such people. It'd be hard not to know there's any such people. But you may nonetheless not really appreciate the fact that all of those perspectives, or at least some number of different perspectives.
I would say that's the majority of journalists.
That which is most journalists.
That the third type. that does not consider that there is a different perspective.
I think that's really right. I think we lack the language that we need. I think we sort of got two types. We got this kind of classical Enlightenment, reason, objective facts sort of folks. And then we have these radical perspectival people who are very aware of different perspectives. And they may think there's no way forward. There's simply just the exercise of power from your own perspective. There are people like that. And then, and I suspect that you have journalists of both types, maybe more of that traditional enlightened perspective. There's an objective human reason. There's objective facts. You hear people talk that way all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Others deny that, right? They use language like your truth, right? Your truth, et cetera. You hear that kind of language pouring in, which you wonder how on earth these things come together, right? And what we're talking about in this podcast series is a third alternative. This is what McIntyre's just made his whole career on, actually. And it seems to me he's unquestionably right that there is a third possibility. Whether there's anything to it or not is another question. Is it possible to bring in a kind of objectivity where what you think and your perspective is what it is, known to you as least as well? There's always fleeting dimensions to it, right? There's always turning and changing. Mm. But there are some kind of coherence, it seems, right? And some kind of fidelity to that coherent approach that people can take. And whether I understand you is a question of whether you say I do. Mm. And that is a legitimate intellectual task for me to undertake. And when I do undertake it, I am now more informed than I was before. Whereas before, when I was warping what you said into my categories, I was simply not understanding you. And in that kind of exchange, there is the possibility of agreement for two different sets of reasons on some common ways forward, some emerging ways forward. And that's a different sort of perspective. And that perspective looks for something else out of journalism other than just the objective facts, or make it whatever you want it to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
Rachel, I'm hoping you're still kicking.
I'm here. I'm listening.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
I was just driving, so I went on mute. I got kicked out, but I popped back in. I've been listening. Great conversation, but I was driving, so I put it on mute and set it to the side. But I am, in fact, here.
Well, glad you're still here. Glad you hung in there with us. I apologize for going on and on so long.
No problem. It was great.
It was a good conversation. We covered a lot of ground. We dug up a lot of soil, really, and dug around in it for a bit. And I think that was very good.
Yeah, that was fun. I think we could potentially have a whole nother conversation on COVID in schools, because I don't know how much time we actually spent on that, but
I think we could.
I think without actually going into it all. What was that?
I think it actually could be an even more productive conversation once we have more data about what happens once, like, more schools go back.
Yeah. And it is really interesting to me right now because it doesn't really seem to be a particularly partisan issue. There are a lot of different people on different sides who have different interesting opinions on why schools should go back or why they shouldn't. Especially college is kind of its own deal. Almost more interesting is high school and middle school. I think childcare and people having to work, and there's just a lot of different factors that come into play in those cases that make it a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, good point. There's some kids that my mom watches that their mom is considering, if they're not able to go back to school, she's just going to have to quit her job and homeschool them from home. So there's a lot of like, I'm starting to see like people that I know, the real life implications of these policy decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Well, thanks, guys.
Yeah.
We should say goodnight for the time being.
Yeah, definitely.
The world is. All right.
All right. See you guys later.
Yep. Bye.